You can feel the cold seeping through the stone beneath your bare feet. The chamber smells of damp wool and something metallic, fear perhaps, or the iron brazier smoking in the corner. Strange hands reach toward you, and you want to run, but guards stand at every door. You are 14 years old, and you have never felt more naked, more vulnerable, more utterly powerless than in this moment. The Duchess of Bedford's eyes sweep over you like you're a mare being evaluated at market. This is not a medical examination. This is judgment. And if these women find what they're looking for, or worse, if they don't, your life as you know it ends today. Before we go deeper into this forgotten corner of history, I'm genuinely curious. Where in the world are you watching this from? It amazes me that we can explore these buried truths together across continents and centuries, connected by the same questions about what humans are capable of doing to each other. The girl trembling in that examination room was Blanche of Navarre, a Spanish princess brought to France in 1440 to marry the heir to the French throne. But this story isn't really about her marriage. It's about what happened 13 years later when she was 29 years old and still a virgin. 13 years of sharing a bed with a husband who never once touched her. 13 years of whispered speculation in every corridor of the royal court. And now, in 1453, she would be stripped naked and examined by royal midwives to prove what her body had endured in silence, that she had remained untouched throughout her entire marriage. The examination was ordered by the king himself, not to protect Blanche, but to protect the kingdom's legal interests in annulling a marriage that had produced no heirs. Her body had become evidence in a political proceeding. Her most private reality would be documented, witnessed, and entered into official court records that still exist today in the French royal archives. But here's what the records don't fully capture. Blanche was not unique. She was not even unusual. In the hidden architecture of medieval power, every woman who wore a crown or hoped to wear one understood a horrifying truth. Your body was never truly yours. It belonged to the state, to the church, to the complex machinery of dynastic succession that depended on one thing above all else: certainty of paternity. And the only way to guarantee that certainty, in an age before genetic testing, was to verify that a bride came to her wedding bed completely untouched by any other man. The stakes were almost incomprehensible. A single royal heir could determine whether a kingdom survived or collapsed into civil war, whether trade routes opened or closed, whether provinces remained loyal or rebelled, whether thousands lived or died in wars of succession. All of this might hinge on the condition of a membrane inside a woman's body, a membrane so fragile it could be damaged by horseback riding, by strenuous labor, by a dozen activities that had nothing to do with sex. Some women weren't even born with intact hymens. Others lost them to the ordinary physical demands of medieval life, hauling water, working in fields, climbing stairs in heavy gowns. But these biological realities were irrelevant to courts obsessed with female purity. An absent or damaged hymen was interpreted as proof of sexual activity, regardless of the actual cause. So they developed tests. Dozens of them. Each more elaborate and degrading than the last. The most straightforward method was direct physical examination by royal midwives. But medieval minds, twisted by superstition and desperation to control female sexuality, created procedures that bordered on the occult. Consider the sieve test, a ritual so absurd it would be darkly comedic if it hadn't destroyed real lives. A woman would be handed a kitchen sieve and ordered to fill it with water in front of a crowd of male observers. If the sieve held water without leaking, she was declared a virgin. If water escaped through the holes, as it inevitably would, she was deemed impure. The logic was grotesque. A leaky sieve was like a leaky body. A vessel that couldn't hold water couldn't hold virtue. Women became experts at cheating this test, coating the inside of sieves with lanolin or beeswax to temporarily seal the holes. But even this small act of resistance required extraordinary courage. If you were caught manipulating the test, The punishment was far worse than simply failing it. You weren't just unchaste, you were a deceiver, a fraud, a woman who tried to corrupt the natural order. Then there were the urine tests. Medieval physicians believed they could determine virginity by examining a woman's bodily fluids with the same confidence modern doctors read blood panels. A 13th-century medical text, the Secretis Mulierum, states with complete certainty that the urine of virgins is clear and lucid, sometimes white, sometimes sparkling. Another expert recommended listening carefully because a virgin urinates with a subtle hiss and, indeed, takes longer than a small boy. Imagine the scene. Noble ladies, daughters of kings and dukes, standing before male physicians in cold examination rooms, forced to urinate into chamber pots while strange men leaned close, listening for the particular sound that would determine their fate. Their humiliation was systematic, calculated, and considered perfectly normal by everyone involved. Some tests ventured into pure magic. One 11th-century writer suggested placing a magnet under the pillow of a suspected adulteress. If she was faithful, she would embrace her husband in her sleep. If she had betrayed him, she would leap from the bed in terror, fleeing from frightening visions conjured by the stone. But perhaps the most disturbing were the fumigation tests. Niccolò Falcucci, a 15th-century Italian physician, wrote detailed instructions. Cover a woman with cloth, then fumigate her with burning coals. If she's a virgin, he claimed, she won't smell the smoke through her mouth and nose. Women were literally smoked like meat, while physicians watched for their reactions to toxic fumes. The women who performed the physical examinations, usually midwives, should have been allies. They understood female bodies. They knew the unreliability of hymens as indicators of sexual activity. Yet most participated without protest, becoming instruments of a system designed to control women through their own bodies. Why would women betray other women so readily? The answer is suffocating in its simplicity. Medieval society had so thoroughly convinced women of their own inferiority, their inherent wickedness and untrustworthiness, that many midwives genuinely believed they were protecting social order by conducting these examinations. The oppression was so complete, so internalized, that the oppressed became enthusiastic enforcers of their own subjugation. Some midwives did resist, quietly declaring women to be virgo intacta, when they clearly weren't, creating bonds of secret sisterhood that saved lives. But they were the exception, not the rule. The examination itself followed a brutal protocol. Royal women would be stripped completely naked and placed on tables like specimens awaiting dissection. Multiple witnesses would observe, usually noble ladies of the court, sometimes male physicians, occasionally representatives from foreign kingdoms with political interests in the marriage. The midwives would probe with their fingers, searching for evidence of an intact hymen, noting the condition and appearance of the woman's genitals in clinical detail. Every sensation would be documented, every reaction noted. The examination could last for hours. Catherine of Aragon endured this horror not once, but repeatedly throughout her life. When she first arrived in England in 1501 as a 15-year-old Spanish princess, she was examined to verify her virginity before her marriage to Prince Arthur, the heir to the English throne. Arthur died just months later, and Catherine insisted until her dying day that the marriage had never been consummated, that she had gone to Arthur's bed a virgin and left it the same way. Years later, she married Arthur's younger brother, who became King Henry VIII. For 18 years, they lived as husband and wife. She bore him 6 children, though only one daughter survived. Then Henry wanted to end the marriage. Suddenly, Catherine's virginity, 25 years earlier, became the subject of international legal proceedings. Had she truly been untouched when she married Henry? If she had consummated her marriage to Arthur, then her union with Henry violated biblical law prohibiting a man from marrying his brother's widow. Henry needed to prove she hadn't been a virgin to justify the annulment. Catherine, now in her 40s, found herself defending the most intimate details of her teenage years before courts, theologians, and politicians across Europe. Men who had never met Arthur interrogated her about what had happened in their marriage bed decades earlier. Letters were examined. Witnesses were called. The Spanish royal archives were searched for documentation of her original virginity examination. The cruelty was the point. Henry didn't actually care about the theological implications. He wanted a new wife who might give him a male heir. But to get what he wanted, he needed to reduce Catherine. This proud Spanish princess, this queen who had ruled England as regent during his absence, to a body whose value could be questioned, a piece of evidence that might or might not support his political goals. Catherine fought with extraordinary dignity. In court, she knelt before Henry and delivered a speech that still echoes through history. "I take God and all the world to witness that I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever comfortable to your will and pleasure, and when ye had me at first, I take God to be my judge, I was a true maid, without touch of man." But her words, her certainty, her lived experience, none of it mattered as much as the political needs of men in power. Joan of Arc faced virginity examinations for entirely different reasons, yet the underlying assumption was identical. A woman's spiritual authority depended on the physical condition of her genitals. In 1429, Joan arrived at the French court claiming to receive visions from God, messages that France would defeat the English and that the Dauphin would be crowned king. She was a 17-year-old peasant girl with no military training, no political connections, no obvious reason why anyone should listen to her, except she was a virgin. Medieval Christianity had created a theological framework where virginity equaled purity, and purity equaled access to divine truth. If Joan had been sexually active, her visions would have been automatically dismissed as delusions, or worse, communications from the devil. But if she was truly untouched, then perhaps God had chosen her as a vessel for his will. So, before anyone would listen to her military strategies or her political prophecies, Joan was examined. Not once, but multiple times. The Dauphin's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, oversaw the first examination at Tours. Later, the Duchess of Bedford conducted another when Joan was captured by the English. The theological implications were staggering. Joan's courage on the battlefield meant nothing compared to the condition of her hymen. Her strategic brilliance that had turned the tide of the 100 Years' War was less important than whether royal midwives could confirm an intact membrane. God's voice, apparently, could only be trusted if it came through an untouched female body. Joan understood this. During her trial for heresy, the trial that would end with her burning at the stake, she was asked about her certainty of salvation. She replied carefully, "I believe I shall be saved, provided that I keep my oath and promise to our Lord to keep safe my virginity of body and of soul." Even facing death, she knew her virginity was inseparable from her spiritual legitimacy. The wedding night became another form of examination, perhaps the most invasive of all. Royal couples didn't consummate their marriages in private. Witnesses would escort them to the bridal chamber, sometimes remaining in the room or just outside the door. In the morning, servants would rush to examine the bedsheets for bloodstains. These stains would be displayed to wedding guests like trophies. Sometimes they were preserved as legal evidence. In some cases, they were sent to foreign courts as proof that a marriage had been properly consummated and the bride had indeed been a virgin. The irony was brutal. Hymens don't reliably bleed when torn. Some women experience no bleeding during first intercourse. Others bleed from causes unrelated to hymens. The entire ritual was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of female anatomy. Yet it continued for centuries, because it served a deeper purpose than medical accuracy. It was about control. Royal physicians and theologians knew these tests were unreliable. They had access to medical texts that explained the variability of hymens and bleeding, but they continued using blood-stained sheets as evidence because the ritual itself was the point. It demonstrated that no matter how high a woman's birth, No matter how much power she might wield as queen, her body could be examined, judged, and found wanting by men at any time. Women developed elaborate strategies to survive. Medieval medical texts like the Trotula offered advice that reveals the desperation these women faced. One suggestion involved placing leeches on the labia the day before a wedding, allowing them to feed until blood flowed and a scab formed in the right place. The bride would then break open the scab during intercourse, creating the appearance of a torn hymen. The pain must have been excruciating, but it was preferable to the consequences of failing a virginity test. Other methods were more theatrical. Some women obtained vials of chicken blood from household butchering operations, hiding them in jewelry or clothing to be discreetly spilled on sheets during the wedding night. Others coordinated complex substitutions, arranging for virginal servants to take their place in the dark bridal chamber long enough to provide the necessary blood evidence. The planning required for these deceptions speaks to absolute terror. Women became experts in their own survival, developing knowledge networks that operated completely outside official channels. They shared information in whispered conversations, in letters written in careful code, in demonstrations disguised as innocent preparation for marriage. The psychological damage was immense and lasting. Women who underwent these examinations reported feelings that modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of trauma: shame, violation, dissociation from their own bodies, difficulty with intimacy, persistent anxiety about being examined again. They learned to view their bodies not as homes they inhabited, but as evidence that could be used against them at any moment. They understood that their worth as human beings depended on the condition of tissue so fragile it could be damaged by a vigorous dance or a hard fall. Blanche of Navarre's examination in 1453 should have vindicated her. The midwives confirmed what she had lived with in silence for 13 years. She was indeed still a virgin despite more than a decade of marriage. Her husband, Henry IV of Castile, had never consummated their union. But the confirmation brought no relief. She was sent back to Navarre, her marriage annulled, her youth and childbearing years consumed by a union that had never truly existed. She had proven her virtue, but at the cost of everything she might have hoped for from life: children, companionship, the simple dignity of not having her most intimate reality examined by strangers and documented in court records. She died in 1464 at the age of 40, never having married again. The examination rooms where these women suffered have crumbled to dust. The men who ordered these violations have been forgotten by history, but the assumptions that justified these practices, that women's bodies are appropriate subjects for male scrutiny and control, that female sexuality must be managed by political and religious authorities, that a woman's word about her own body is less reliable than a physician's examination. These ideas persisted for centuries. They persist still, in modified forms, in the 60 countries where virginity testing remains legal today. When the United Nations finally condemned virginity testing as a human rights violation in 2018, they were rejecting practices that medieval European courts had perfected and exported to the world. The language of the UN statement echoes with the pain of women like Blanche and Catherine and Joan. Painful, humiliating, and traumatic, a violation of human rights. But perhaps the most haunting legacy is the simplest one. Somewhere in the French royal archives, there exists a document from 1453 describing in clinical detail the condition of Blanche of Navarre's body. It notes that she was examined, that her virginity was confirmed, that the marriage could be legally annulled. It reduces the suffering of 13 years to a few bureaucratic sentences. The document doesn't record her trembling as strange hands touched her. It doesn't preserve the cold she felt seeping through stone into her bare feet. It doesn't capture the moment she realized that despite being a princess, despite her noble birth and royal marriage, she had no more control over her own body than a prisoner in a dungeon. That knowledge, that terror, is what these women lived with every day. And somehow, impossibly, they survived.